My baby dolls! Playoff fever's in the air. Welcome back to another episode of Genesis. As always, I'm your host, Ian Kahanowitz. And although this podcast is going to be released at a later date and the Yankees and the Astros would have begun this Saturday the American League Championship Series, I am giddy today because my Yankees came back against the Cleveland Indians. And, of course, Terry Francona is the skipper of the Indians, who, coincidentally, was the skipper of the 2004 Red Sox that came back historically to beat the Yankees in 4 straight games. Here, the Yankees had a barrel back. And so I'm giddy. And, you know, we still got Washington and the Cubbies to decide who's going to go there to the championship with the Dodgers. But today we're going to be talking about Cubby baseball and Boston Brave baseball, because we're going to be talking about Johnny Evers. And most of you have heard the phrase, hey, Tinker to Evans to Chance, you know, those great Cub teams, which was pretty much, I would say, the first dynasty in Major League Baseball if you actually go back in time. And you see that they went to 4 World Series and won 2 of them. So I just got done with the 1910 A's and Cubs. And, you know, that was a great book, and soon the show will be published because I recorded it a few days ago with Richard Bresnan. A great book, and it talks about the demise of the Cubs, but, you know, Evers was key on it. We have author Dennis Snelling. He returns to the show, if you remember. Earlier in the season, we had Lefty O'Doul, you know, his brand-new book that came out this year. Excellent book, and I learned so much about Lefty O'Doul, stuff I never knew, and you know something? I learned a lot about Johnny Evers that I never knew. One of them is his feud with Tinker for many years, and I just never knew that, maybe because I just was blindsided, but Dennis does a great job in laying out the story. The book is a stellar book. It was a 2014 Casey Award. It was a finalist for the 2015 Seamweller Medal. I love the way Dennis writes. I'm sure Lefty O'Doul is going to get its accolations when the award ceremonies start nominating folks. Great books. I can't say enough of it. Before we get to Dennis and before we get to Johnny Evers, you are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho himself, you know, good old Alameda, California, all these guys, all the big shots, you know, they all live in California, and me, I'm stuck up here in Boston where the weather is turning cold, and soon we're going to have that white stuff on the ground that's going to screw up traffic and make life miserable with snow blowers and stuff. But, you know, all the big shots, they live on the West Coast, I'm on the East Coast, and I was talking to Dennis before the show, and I know he wrote a book, The Greatest Minor League, and you know, the Pacific Coast League, I've always fancied. I think I spoke about it with him when he was on the show with Lefty O'Doul. You had a lot of great players coming out of the DiMaggios. You had Billy Martin. You had Ted Williams. Some of the greatest players to play the game came out of the Pacific Coast League. Johnny Evers, though, he came out of Troy, New York, I believe, and I've been to Troy, New York. Not much of a town. It's next to Albany and Schenectady, and interesting stuff, though. You know, we're going to get into that. And a little bit about Dennis. You know, Dennis has been writing for a while, and, you know, and Snelling's greatest minor league book was published in 2011. That was a finalist for the Casey Award as a baseball book. And his Johnny Evers, as I mentioned, 2014 and 2015 Seymour Medal finalist. I loved all that stuff because, again, this is stuff that obscure stuff that people really don't, you know, talk about. Dennis himself is a member of the Society for American Baseball Research and the Pacific Coast League Historical Society. See what I mean? I mean, this is all good stuff. He is a 2-time Casey Award finalist, which again, for baseball book, and you know, he lives in California. Like I said, all the big shots, they live in California. Without any further ado, welcome to the show, Dennis.
Yeah, thank you, Ian, for having me here.
You know, it's great. You know, all you guys, you know, I speak to Brett Boone almost on a daily basis. I speak to Ralph Tycho. All you big guys are out in California. I mean, you guys even had your own league. So what got you interested in an Eastern boy like Johnny Evers?
Well, I actually started doing a book on the Miracle Braves because the 100th anniversary is coming up. And there were quite a few books coming out about that, and the publisher McFarland asked me if I would be interested in switching over to a biography of someone on that team, and suggested Evers. And so I said, well, let me write a chapter, see if I can find an angle that I like, and if I like his story, and I did, and it expanded into the book that came out.
And let me ask you this, because I love the books that McFarland puts out. I also know, I think Lefty was published by University of Nebraska Press. Do you see any difference between these publishing companies, like, style that they ask for? Do they do much editing of your manuscript and stuff like that?
Well, Nebraska Press actually has a commercial arm, which McFarland does not. So you won't find McFarland books in the bookstore. They're pretty much direct mail, and their books are more expensive. At the same time, they're more print on demand, so they can carry more obscure type of titles and publish quite a few more. Nebraska Press, you'll find their books in Barnes & Noble, et cetera. They do have an editor that you work with. I haven't had too many problems with either publisher as far as editing. I like the editing process, so that doesn't bother me. I don't look at every word as being sacrosanct. I'm interested in putting out the best product I can, and someone else has a great idea or an idea that smooths over a passage, I'm fine with that.
Hey, because I tell people I got my manuscript almost done on the Ty Cobb and Tris Speaker affair. And
oh yeah.
Yeah, no one's ever written about it. I got 400 pages into it, and I don't know. I got all my. I made my bibliography. I made my source notes, my end notes, and whatever. And so I know I'm going to have to build that index when they get it. But so for me, I'm shopping around to see which is probably the best publishing company. And I'm in contact with both of them, so they're going to read it. And authors like yourself have given me recommendations there. So I'm thinking maybe 6 months to a year for them to publish it, but we'll see. But Johnny Evers, he was born in Troy, New York. How did he get interested in baseball?
Well, Troy was a real baseball hotbed at the time. A lot of people don't realize that Troy actually had a team both in the National Association and in the National League. They were a major league team for about 4 years in the 1870s and 1880s. Several Hall of Famers came out there. Old King Kelly was actually born in Troy, and there were players like Roger Connor and Tim Keefe. Some Hall of Fame. I think there were 5 Hall of Famers that played on the Troy team. Ultimately, Troy and Worcester were taken out of the National League and replaced with New York and Philadelphia, I think. The New York Giants came pretty much from the Troy team. Buck Ewing was another guy who was on Troy. And the San Francisco Giants actually still trace their roots back to Troy. And to this day, Troy and Worcester are still honorary members of the National League. So he grew up in a town that was kind of a real baseball hotbed. His uncle played in the Union Association as a left-handed second baseman, which very rare. It's considered kind of the toughest position at a left-handed thrower. There's been a few in the history of the game, but not very many, and certainly not any really since the early 20th century, either in the majors or the minors. So he kind of grew up in a baseball family in a baseball town. And if you look at his life, it was really all sports. That's just, he grew up always interested in it. His dad was a fan of the game. And he just kind of grew up in it and fell in love with all sports, but especially baseball.
And, I think his father worked as a saloon keeper, if I remember reading in your book. Now, let me ask you, they had all these local baseball teams, besides the city team. Was there saloon teams versus like another saloon teams like you had with the industry? Like one factory would have a team and would play against another factory.
Oh yeah, I mean there were all sorts of teams there. I think Evers talked about growing up in Troy, and there'd be games basically almost on top of each other. He even started his own league. He was very into organizing things. Kind of fits into his personality if you think about it. And yes, there were all sorts of company teams, town teams, neighborhood teams that would play against each other. It was just a game that was played everywhere and by everybody.
And then we know Evers attended St. Joseph's Elementary School, and he played Sandlot Ball in Troy, like you mentioned. My question here is, when did he hone his craft as a second baseman?
Well, I think that really came. He really started out as a shortstop.
Yep. And
he was signed to the New York State League team in Troy, the local team. So that's really where, he ran into a manager named Lou Bacon who had seen him play Sandlot Ball and had kept trying to get him to come play. And he put him in at shortstop, and it took him a couple of weeks to really get going at the plate. He ended up actually leading that league in home runs and was quite a hitter. And that's really where he started to blossom there. But at shortstop, it became, especially by the end of that first year, he was already up with the Cubs. That's how quickly he progressed. And but it became pretty apparent quickly that he wasn't a shortstop. And most of his errors were throwing errors. And they moved him to second base, and it was like instant success as far as a defensive player. He was just a natural second baseman. And he took to it right away. And then over time, he just kept coming up with techniques, which I'm sure we'll talk about, that really revolutionized second base play.
Now, let me ask you this about Evers. What's interesting here is the Class B New York State League. Is that part of the New York Penn League now, or is it still a different league?
I'm not sure that the league exists anymore.
Yeah, all right, because I know they got a New York, Pennsylvania league, and a lot of
right.
Were harbored into it because of the border, like Bingham.
Yeah, I'm not sure the lineage of where the New York State League went off the top of my head, but.
And what's interesting about Evers is he wasn't a big guy at all. He was like around 100 pounds, and when I think 130 pounds, and he was what, 5'9"? I mean, he wasn't.
He was not a big guy, but at the same time, 5'9" was probably average height. When you're going back to 1900, he's often caricatured as he was scrawny, no doubt about that, but he wasn't that tiny. There were other players that were much smaller. So actually, he was probably average height, but he was very thin.
Well, let me ask you this. Where did he get his temper? Because he had a huge temper as well for such a little guy. Almost like McGraw when you think about it.
Well, I always talk about his head seemed to be put on. He'd make a natural bobblehead. His jaw, he had a lantern jaw, and his head almost looked like it was put on a little crooked, like he was already upset before you even talked to him. He just seemed to be born with that temperament. He was a fighter from, and I don't mean just, picking fights. I mean, he was a scrapper. He was a fighter for everything he got. He was always trying to find an angle. And that was his personality. He always seemed to have that temper.
Yeah, and I mean, like you said, he made a lot of errors. And Frank Seeley, who was the manager of the Cubs, was scouting, I think, at the time, Evers' teammate, pitcher Alex Hardy. But he was also looking for a second baseman. Here we got, Evers is at short. And due to an injury to the starter, Bobby Lowe, he purchased Hardy and Evers' contract for $1,500, for God's sakes.
Oh, right. I mean, a bargain, and there's even some stories go that the Cubs never even really paid the money, so they really got a bargain.
Now let me ask you, he makes his debut with the Cubs late in the year on September 1st at shortstop. And how far, how many games before he actually moved Evers to second and Tinker to short?
Well, as you mentioned, Bobby Lowe was having some knee problems that would go into the next season. So he went right into the lineup at shortstop and played a doubleheader his first game, and actually didn't play that well and was sure he was going to get sent back to Troy. As you mentioned, manager Frank Fleet, told him, "No, you're fine. You're staying here." And so I would say that it was probably about a week, and then he was moved to second base because Lowe was having the knee problems, and so he moved to second base pretty quickly. And he made I think it was 6 or 7 errors in 6 games at shortstop, and then played 20 games at second base and didn't make a single error. And the Chicago Press was already talking about, I think there's a quote from a sports writer talking about young Evers leads all the second basemen in the country for the 20 or so games he's played. And they were meaning that he hadn't made an error. He was leading in fielding. So he was kind of an instant sensation even with the Chicago Press once he moved to second base.
Now let me ask you this. And we'll get into technique here because I think this is a good place to talk about it. In the New York League, as a hitter, he led the league in home runs, like we mentioned. He had to get 10 home runs. And in those years, again, you're playing during the dead ball era. You got to keep in mind you had one ball. And, to hit 10 home runs is a huge accomplishment, especially for a little guy. But let me ask you this. I think he had led the league, if I'm not mistaken, in errors, or was up there. But now at second baseman, he has an unorthodox manner. He slides over the ground balls. He gobbled them up. They named him like the human crab or something like that.
Yeah, there were differing opinions on whether he was human crab for his disposition or his moving side to side to grab balls. He was definitely unorthodox and caught attention. He was a flashy player. One might even call him a hot dog today, or and he was always looking for ways to play the game in a way. He was always looking for an angle. How could he do better? And so he came up with the sweep tag. He came up with coming across the bag as you caught the ball. A lot of the modern ways of playing second base that we think of today, the snap throw. And these things weren't very easy then. When you look at a glove that was really no bigger than your hand, he had to come up with techniques to be able to do that. And like I said, he really revolutionized the play. Within the first couple of years, he was developing a lot of these techniques that became really the standard. It was the birth of the modern play of second base.
Now let me ask you this: what was the big difference between shortstop and second base? Was it easier for Evers to take a look at first because he was closer to first? Why? Was he too young and not mature enough? He didn't understand the position of shortstop very well. What made a difference with second base?
I think it was his throwing arm. I think it just wasn't suited to shortstop for whatever reason, whether it wasn't strong enough or he couldn't be accurate from that distance. I think you're making more, you can make quicker reactive throws at second base, where at shortstop you may be going deep in a hole and you just have to wind up and fire. The normal way to play back then was you caught the ball, you set your feet, and then you threw. That was one of the things with Evers with the snap throw, and that's something you really can't do at shortstop. It's too far. You could make a snap throw to second, but it's kind of tough if you're going away from first. You're not really able to make a snap throw. And he talked about, instead of setting your feet, being able to throw on the run with a snap throw. And he talked about the amount of time you'd save if you saved, a tenth of a second, that was like 2.8 feet. And a runner, he analyzed it's like before there were sabermetrics, he was already doing analysis of that kind of thing and how much time it saved to be able to learn to throw on the run. So I think his athletic ability, he was a very good athlete, but I think his arm wasn't suited to shortstop because almost all of the errors that I found when he played shortstop, and he would go back to the position once in a while over his career. He actually did better at third base than he did at short, which kind of, again, feeds into the idea of being able to, the strength of the arm. Shortstop has to have the strongest arm, and I think he just didn't have the arm to play that because almost all the errors were throwing errors.
Now, let me ask you this. We know, like I mentioned, he began on September 1st, 1902. And what I failed to mention was this was like a trial basis for him. And it was totally unimpressive. I mean, he batted at .222. He showed promise at second. He really didn't develop into what we were just talking about. But let's talk about Bobby Lowe and how that injury lasted throughout the winter. And by spring training, he wasn't ready.
Right. Lowe had played, Salih had these, the manager of the Cubs, had a real dynasty in Boston in the late 1800s. And Lowe had been the second baseman on what was considered the greatest, up to that time, the greatest infield in the history of baseball. And so Lowe was in his late 30s. I mean, he was very advanced age for a ball player in those days. He was nearly 40 years old, but he was still a very good ball player. And when the 1903 season started, as you noted, Evers had showed promise, but he wasn't, an established star by any means. And he was not a starter when the season started. There are a lot of people saying that Lowe was almost like a Wally Pipp, and once he was out, Evers was in. It wasn't that way at all. Lowe started out the next season at second base, but was having trouble, and Tinker was playing third originally, and they moved him over to short. And with Lowe's knee problem, they moved him over to first for a while because Frank Chance was there, but he was a catcher at the time. And then they moved Evers into second, so they had Tinker at short, Evers at second, and Lowe at first. And then Lowe just couldn't, the knee bothered him, so they moved Chance into first, and that's when the Cubs came up with their infield that would really carry them for the next decade. So, and then Lowe finally was cut from the team later in the year when a physician looked at the knee. He had a cracked knee and said he wasn't going to be able to play the rest of the year. Lowe went on to play, however, another 3 or 4 years, and even was played against the Cubs in the World Series of 1907. He was like a 42-year-old utility player for the Tigers. So he still had some baseball left in him, but his regular everyday playing days were pretty much over, and Evers was just better than Lowe at that point.
And what's interesting here is now that, Evers won the position by default, what techniques did he employ to raise his batting average? Because I think he batted .293 that year in 1903, and he stole 25 bases. So what was he doing different now?
I'm not sure he was doing anything different other than getting more experience. He was his harshest critic, and I think, but it's interesting. He was, the way the game was played back then, he was asked to sacrifice a lot, especially as a young player, until he showed some hitting ability. And he really just kind of came on. I don't think he had an extra base hit in that month he played in 1902. But as you pointed out, in 1903, it's nearly 300, which was quite a feat in the dead ball era. There were, people don't realize that, there weren't a lot of 300 hitters back then. And for him to hit nearly 300, he probably would have won Rookie of the Year had there been such an award. So I don't know that he was doing anything different other than, if you look at Troy, he started out slow, and once he got his feet wet, he started hitting extremely well. And I think it was the same thing. He started out slowly with the Cubs at the end of 1902, but once he felt a part of things, which I think was a big deal with him, feeling a part of the team. If you look, a recurring theme is over his life is when he felt threatened or felt not accepted, bad things would happen. He would erupt. And I think once he felt a part of the team, I think, sort of goes back to what Lefty O'Doul talked about. Most of hitting is mental, or as Yogi Berra said, 50% of the game is 50% hitting is 90% mental, or whatever, however he put it. And I think a lot of it was just his.
He said 90% of it's mental, the other half is physical.
Yeah, there you go. And so I think a lot of it was just his mental approach more than hitting. He worked on his hitting, but it was his defense. I think he loved defense and really thought about that more. But certainly he was a much better hitter than people give him credit for.
Now let me ask you this: you got Tinker at short, you got Evers at second base, you got Chance at first, combined with third baseman Harry Steinfeld, catcher Johnny King. Do you think this was the most prolific infield of all time?
It's up there. I mean, people talk about they didn't turn the most double plays and all that, but look at that Cubs pitching staff, how great that was. And they didn't allow a lot of base runners versus other teams. And their defense was very interesting. It was predicated on moving just on about every pitch. A pitcher was expected to throw the ball to a certain spot, and everybody knew what the pitches were. And Evers was actually the catalyst, and they would move almost as a unit. It was almost like a military maneuver, and they would move on every pitch, and it would be based on Evers would signal the rest of the infield and the outfield on where to move on the pitch. And the idea was to cut off the gaps. Back then, it was basically gaps in the infield and the outfield. And they would try to close those gaps based on where the pitch was being thrown to the hitter. And they would move as the pitcher released the ball, and they were just really in sync and were together a long time, and I think that's why it worked. But the infield was why the infield, if you look at how their pitchers did when they left the Cubs, they were never as effective. It was a combination of great pitching and a great infield.
Now, the Cubs are changing at this time, and they're really building a nice team. What was the impact that Charles Murphy had on the team when he purchased the franchise in 1905 for $125,000?
Well, I think he kept the team together. James Hart, the previous owner, and Frank Slee had really built the team. But Slee came down with tuberculosis and had to leave the team in 1905. And Hart had been running the team for quite a while and decided he wanted to get out of the game. So Murphy, who was a newspaper man from Cincinnati, got some backing from William Howard Taft's brother, Taft being at the time the vice president of the United States and future president, and bought the Cubs and took them over. He would eventually kind of tear them apart with his personality, but he kept the team together, and I think that was the big thing. And then he brought in Chance as manager and made him player manager, and I think that was a big stroke of genius, whether that was accidental or on purpose. And that really set the team in motion.
Now, when Seeley got sick and they put Chance in, look what he did. The Cubs responded by winning 4 pennants and 2 World Series over a 5-year span. What did Chance do differently than Seeley to make the Cubs this successful, including a 116-win season for the 1906 Cubs? And we'll get into that World Series because that was a quite disappointment for the Cubs. They should have crushed the White Sox, but they didn't. But what made Chance so good?
Well, he was an excellent judge of talent. He really was the one who was scouting and coming up with players. He was the one who made the trade to get Three-Finger Brown from the St. Louis Cardinals. And Brown became the ace of the staff. He knew players. Being a catcher, I think, was a big plus in understanding pitchers and going out and getting them. And the Cubs had tremendous pitching with Ed Rulebach, and Orville overall was a guy that the Cincinnati Reds didn't think much of, and Chance grabbed him. Chance had a real eye for talent, especially pitching talent. And when you put that together, I mean, the Cubs had an unprecedented run. You look at, they averaged 106 wins a year over a 5-year span in a 154-game schedule. They won 116 games and lost only 36 in 1906. There was a stretch where they won 102 of 122 games. It's just incredible what a machine they were when they got going. And I think Chance's eye for talent had a lot to do with that. And he had the respect of the players. He was a leader. Tinker and Evers might have battled with each other, but they listened to Chance. And as long as that group was together, Chance was kind of the adult in the room, so to speak. And Evers and Tinker were the fighting younger brothers. And they really respected Chance. And I think that was a lot of it. Was both. I think that made him unique, a great eye for talent, plus he was a great leader.
You know, for people who really don't study the dead ball era, like I have in the last 4 years, if you would have asked me 4 years ago anything on the dead ball era, I would just say Walter Johnson, Ty Cobb, and maybe Honus Wagner. But in my studies, everyone always throws out Tinkers to Evers to Chance. Where was that phrase coined?
It was a newspaper writer, a New York newspaper writer, who was a Cubs fan named Franklin Adams. And it was kind of an accidental thing. He was about to rush out to see a game the Cubs were playing in New York, supposedly, although, it's not clear that that's truly how it happened. They're a little romanticized. But he had a deadline and just kind of threw these lines as a poem. He used to do little poems, and it became an instant hit. And before long, there were actually other versions of it, and every city would come up with its own version. But the original one was the one that stuck, that Franklin Adams wrote.
Now let me ask you this. Why did Tinker and Evers not get along with each other? And they didn't talk for many years, as I recall in your book.
Well, they really didn't talk off the field for a couple of years, but there are versions out there where they supposedly didn't speak for 30 years and reunited at the 37 World Series or something, and that's not true. But they were both just strong personalities, and there was actually an incident. There used to be, for quite a while into the 1900s, in-season exhibition games. So if there was an off day, there would usually be a lot of times major league teams would go and play one of the minor league teams, and quite often it was like a hometown of one of the major league team players, and they would have a day for them. And it was just a way to make a little bit of money beyond just the regular schedule. So these are quite often, if you go to Retro Sheet, they have a whole list of all of the in-season major league exhibition games, and it's kind of fascinating to look at some of these. And so it was a way of also promoting the game outside of the big city to other folks. And so there happened to be one in West Bedford, Indiana, near the end of the 1905 season. And Evers and Tinker were already kind of bickering a little bit, and there was one day where Evers had promised to have a cab to the ballpark. Cab at those days being a horse-drawn carriage. It wasn't a motor car in 1905. But he had promised arrange for one, and they would all go to the park together. And Tinker was extremely superstitious and had a routine every day to get to the ballpark, and that involved this cab. Well, Evers, knowing that, basically ignored it and took off without Tinker. And when Tinker finally got to the ballpark, he was already hot and went out, and they basically had a fist fight in the outfield. And that was kind of, as best I can tell, that's kind of the genesis of issues between them. And Evers earlier in the year had broken his hand, and he always talked about Tinker throwing a ball at him real hard, real close. It's not clear when that happened. Evers was always kind of not the most accurate in talking about things in terms of time. And but the best I can tell that makes sense is it would have happened around the same time, which would kind of indicate why they were already having trouble and then led to this fight.
Now, let me ask you something. Now, we have a powerhouse of a team, and they go to the World Series with their crosstown rivals, the White Sox. What happened here? You have a monster of a team, and no one can hit on both sides. The pitching is stellar on both sides. What's going on here?
Yeah, I think that's what it is. The White Sox got the hot hand in the series and beat them in 6 games, which shocked everybody. The White Sox had come out of a very tough pennant race in 1906 and came out on top. And Nick Altrock was their ace, and he won the first game and kind of set in motion. And there's question whether the Cubs, having won by so much, kind of coasted in and everything, but the hitless wonders, they were called. I think they barely hit above 200 as a team for the year, and they ended up winning the World Series, shocked everybody, including the Cubs.
And the next year, the Cubs came back strong. And, a defeat like that, when you win 116 games, look at Seattle of 2001. Same record. They never rose after that like the Cubs did next year. And here we go to the World Series in 1907. We're meeting Ty Cobb. What's going on in the World Series here? We got Wild Bill Donovan out there on the mound for the Tigers.
Yeah, they really took the Tigers apart. And from here on in, I think Evers only lost 1 World Series game the rest of his life. They swept the Tigers, and the next year they played them again and took them in 5 games. And they just really, the pitching again and the defense was just too much for the Tigers. They just, maybe they were taking out their frustration against the White Sox the year before on them, but they weren't going to, I think chance was determined they were not going to lose that World Series in 1907. And the team definitely took it to heart, and they took it to the Tigers.
And, I love this story. One of the major things out of the dead ball era. I got the book. The author died. His name was Anderson, about Fred Merkle. And here we are in 2008. Whenever somebody hears Fred Merkle, they hear Bonehead. Again, he was a rookie. He ended up having a very good career. What happened in this game now between the Cubs and the Giants?
Well, Fred Merkle, he's a young guy. He's 19, as you point out, and he had actually almost died that summer. He got an infection in his leg, and they thought they were going to have to amputate. And he recovered, and he was not a starting player. Fred Tenney, who actually had been part of that great infield with Bobby Lowe back in Boston, was the first baseman for the Giants, kind of winding up his career. And the Giants and Cubs had an incredible rivalry. Christy Matthews and John McGraw were just incredible. And the Cubs, it took them 3 or 4 years to bust through and finally get the best of the Giants. And the battles between Mordecai Brown and Christy Mathewson are just legendary. The rivalry that they had and the pitching against each other. So it was already a pretty heated rivalry anyway. A couple of weeks before this game, Evers had come up with a play against the Pittsburgh Pirates, and another rookie had hit a ball to end an inning or in the game, and had not run all the way to first base, or had not run all the way to second base from first after another player had a base hit. And Evers realized the force play was still in play. In that time, sometimes players would actually just leave the field once the hit was fair and not worry about going to the next base. So in other words, if a runner's on first and someone hits a single and it drives in the run, the runner at first would just take off for the clubhouse and try to get to the shower first instead of going all the way and touching second. So Evers touched second, and he had a fight with umpire Hank O'Day, who refused to listen to him about it. And they kept haranguing him. And by the next day, O'Day realized that Evers was probably right, and he probably should have called him out, but it was too late then. Lo and behold, who's the umpire in this game? It's Hank O'Day is back. And we have the same situation, real battle between the Giants and Cubs. This is in the 1908 season. And Al Bridwell hits a single with Merkel on first. Merkel jumps up and down, excited that the Giants have won the game, and heads off the clubhouse that he didn't touch second. And then all mayhem breaks loose because this is at the Polo Grounds, and the Giants fans think they've won a big game, and they've poured onto the field. At one point, Joe McGinnity realized that Evers was trying to get the ball back and touch second and threw it into the crowd. Nobody knows whether the actual ball was ever recovered, that it was the same ball that touched second. But Evers eventually did get a ball. O'Day was watching, and he touched second, and O'Day ruled that Merkel was out, and the game still tied. And, of course, there was such mayhem that they ended up calling the game. It was already getting dark. But Merkel was instantly branded, the GOAT, and it really haunted him the rest of his life. There was one point where he actually, a couple of years later, pulled a hidden ball trick and caught Evers, which was a great moment for him, but it did not make up for that. He was forever known, and he always had a cloud over him. Even though he had a good career, he played on 6 pennant-winning teams, and all of them lost the World Series. So there was always kind of this cloud over Fred Merkel. And it was always interesting. Evers would make if you look at his life, Evers would make mistakes, and yet he always seemed to get a chance to redeem himself and would follow through. Poor Fred seemed to be one of those guys who, when he made a mistake, he never really got a chance to make up for it. He was an excellent ball player on many excellent teams, and it's kind of unfortunate how one play when he was 19 kind of branded him.
And they win again in the 1908 World Series. Now this is something odd that happens. What the hell's going on with Johnny King? Sat out the whole season for pocket billiard.
Well, you got to realize that the amount of money players made those days wasn't like today. There were ways to make nearly that much money, and King was unhappy with Charles Murphy especially, and felt he should get more credit and more money than he was getting, and he could make enough with his pool hall that he took the year off and held out. And the Cubs did not win in 1909 when he did that.
And let me ask you this. With his absence, because King was playing again, he was right up there since 1904, 1905. Did it hurt the stability of the pitching staff as well as the psyche of the whole club?
He was an excellent catcher. He may have been the best catcher in the game at the time. He was very underrated. He's kind of one of the forgotten keys to that team. And yes, I think it did. And also they started having some sore arms. Overall started dropping off a little bit. They had 4 or 5 really good years, and he'd run these pitchers into the ground, pitching them 300 innings. Jack Taylor, who played for the Cubs during that time, I think still holds the record, throwing 187 straight complete games. So pitching careers were not real long, and so the combination of that and Kling probably didn't help for sure. Kling not being there definitely had a big factor on the 1909 Cubs, although they still won more than 100 games. But Pittsburgh, I think, won 110 or 109 and beat them out for the pennant that year.
And, you know, it's interesting because in 1910 they rebound. And like I asked you before, where did the whole thing of Tinkers to Evers to Chance happen? But here now, in 10 they're rebounding. They're getting older, these guys. And again, back then, if you're 30, you're pretty much old in baseball. It was a rough sport. All three of them were immortalized in Franklin Adams' poem, Baseball's Sad Lexicon, which appeared during the season in July 18th edition of the New York Evening Mail. And I'll read it. These are the saddest of possible words. Tinker to Evans to Chance. Trio of bear cubs and fleeter than birds. Tinker and Evans and Chance. Ruthlessly pricking our Gonfalon bubble. Making a giant hit into a double. Words that are heavy with nothing but trouble. Tinker to Evers to Chance. Now let me ask you something. Just like the Yankees were hated by a lot of people nationally, do you think the Cubs were because of their strength and their geographical zone and the way that the game was played by them in those years?
They were not popular outside of Chicago, and a lot of it was they fought a lot. They were always arguing, scrappy. What then you would call full of ginger is kind of the term. But they were a team you loved to root against if you were in another town, because they were always arguing, always fighting, a lot of fist fights and things like that. How many times you'd fight umpires in those days? You'd never get away with that once here. It's interesting going back and reading all those stories. But yeah, they were the typical team that kind of like the Yankees, that were kind of a dynasty then, and then had a feisty personality on top of that, and were unapologetic about it. So they had an arrogance about them. They had definitely a feistiness to them, and they were extremely successful.
And again, they go to the World Series. Evers, though, he breaks his leg during that season. Do you think that was the reason why they lost to Connie Mack and the Athletics that World Series?
Well, it certainly was a big factor, because Evers was really, I mean, one of the points of the book is that, as I got into him, I think the poem kind of has done him a disservice. He is really, if not the key, certainly one of the big keys to the success of that team. Like I said, he ran the whole defense, and it was almost like the way you'd run a football defense today. It was very involved, and not having him there was definitely a big deal. Whether they would have won or not, who knows? But it certainly didn't help, and it certainly fit in a category with him. Very tragic figure in a lot of ways. But anyway, getting back to the idea of the poem, he really deserved to be looked at separately. In some ways, the poem's done him a disservice by just making him one of three guys. But he really had a lot of influence and importance to that ball club, and I don't think the Cubs would have had the success over that period of time, certainly, if he had not been there. He was kind of an irreplaceable part of that team. Once he wasn't there anymore, look how many years it took the Cubs to win again.
Yeah, I mean, 108 years. Well, let me ask you this question. Evers is getting older. In 1911, he has a nervous breakdown. He invested in a business deal that cost Evers most of his savings. What was going on there?
Well, he had, kind of touching back on he had a lot of tragedy in his life. And it seemed like almost every time something good happened, then something bad would offset it. For instance, when he was signed by the Cubs a week before that, his father died. And it seemed like when he'd have successes. So in 1910, I think his mother died after the Cubs' great 1908 season. just a lot of things that happened, and we'll probably touch on a real tragedy that happened during the Miracle Braves season. But in 1910, he had several things that happened. One, he was driving an automobile and was hit broadside by a trolley car, and it killed his best friend in front of him. And then he broke his leg a week before the World Series, and it was a very nasty injury. There was some feeling that he might never play again. It was a shin bone that protruded through the leg. It was a very nasty injury. And then, as you pointed out, he had a shoe store or a sporting goods store in Troy. Was about to open another one in Chicago, and found out that his partner in Troy had run off with all the funds and basically bankrupted him. So I think it was the combination of those things, and trying to recover physically that ordeal. He finally had a nervous breakdown and missed most of the 1911 season.
And what's interesting here is he comes back the next year. He hits a career high in 1912 of 341. He led the National League with a 431 on-base percentage. Chance wasn't happy. He resigned. He went to the Yankees, and he was fired, depending on whose accounts you believe. And Murphy presents only 31-year-old Evers with a 5-year contract as player manager. That's unprecedented. Then everyone used to just have like 1-year contracts, and then the reserve clause kicks in every year. They wanted to see how well you did. So what's going on? In 1913. And things are going downhill for Evers, where they were going to go trade him the year after.
Well, again, Charles Murphy and his ego, he had gotten rid of Chance right after Chance had brain surgery. Chance was not a well man, had been beamed many times over his career, was deaf in one ear, and Murphy just they had a falling out, and as you said, Chance left or was fired, whichever way. So Evers took over and had a decent season. The Cubs, I think, they didn't win the pennant, obviously, but I think they finished second or third and extended. Evers had never finished below third place, and that would continue on for the rest of his career. He was always in a pennant race every year. But at the end of the year, Murphy wanted to replace him as manager. And Evers said, well, you can't just do that based on the contract, and that ended up making him essentially a free agent. Murphy tried to trade him, and Evers refused, saying you can't do that with a contract, and threatened to jump to the Federal League, where Joe Tinker was trying to get him to jump over. And the National League was panicking because they'd already lost some big players, didn't want to lose Evers, so they worked out. Murphy had wanted to trade him to Boston, and that didn't work out because of Evers objecting. So the National League finally convinced Evers to go there as a free agent, essentially, and he signed probably the richest contract at the time. And then to make sure the Cubs didn't, then the National League owners got together, pushed Murphy out, and got a new owner, and then tried to make the Cubs whole by convincing Boston to give up a player to the Cubs, Bill Sweeney.
I mean, even Evers, he refused to report. He didn't want to go to the Braves. The Braves were a horrible team.
They were. They were the worst team in the league. I think they'd finished. They bounced up a little bit, finished fifth or sixth year before, but they'd been losing more than 100 games every year, and had pretty much been in last place since Salih had left in the 1890s, and they had fallen on real hard times.
Now, let me ask you, what was going on in 1914? We were mentioning that, he's had a hard life, and what was going on with the Braves and this thing that happened with Evers?
Well, the Braves had a good shortstop, Robert Moranville, and a couple good young pitchers that really didn't have much. They were trying to build back up. They had new ownership, and Evers was seen as, they really wanted Evers. They thought he was the big name that they needed, and he was, again, he'd come off two really excellent seasons. He could still play. He was about 33 years old. And they thought he, along with manager George Stallings, who was in second year, were both fighters. Stallings wanted him, and it was thought they could be a good combination. And Evers was seen almost as a manager on the field, and that was really important. Boston was looking for leadership, and Evers was the guy they saw could do that.
And we're talking about 10 weeks. 10 weeks. As soon as they got him, these guys came back from last to first and capped a dream season. Not only did they win the pennant, but they swept Connie Max A's in the 1914 World Series. New book by Charles Alexander came out on the Miracle Braves this year. So he'll be on my show. And Alexander's written great books on Cobb and Spreakin and a whole bunch of other people. But look what he did in the World Series. .438 he batted Evers. Unbelievable. He even won the Chalmers Award as the National League's MVP.
Yeah, he was tremendous that year, and did that while at the same time his 2-year-old daughter died in the middle of the season of scarlet fever. And so, yes, he was named the most valuable player, winning the car, which ironically he didn't drive after the accident that he had that killed his brother Joe would chauffeur him everywhere. But, he's just a tremendous player, and they almost did it again the next year. In 1915, they were in last place, and they ended up almost winning the pennant again. When Evers was playing, a lot of people look at the 1915 season and say he didn't play very well. He was playing on one leg that whole year. He had broken his leg and ended up coming back, or broken his ankle, and ended up coming back playing on the broken ankle without it being fully healed because they really needed him. And they almost did the same thing in 1915. And came back from last place when he missed a month because of the ankle. So he was, again, a tremendous cog for another team that won one pennant and was the first team to sweep a World Series. The Cubs had beaten the Tigers 4-0 in the previous series, but there was also a tie game. This was the first time that any team in the World Series had actually been swept, and he was a big part of that, as you said, hitting .438.
Now, let me ask you this question. You know, his daughter dies, scarlet fever. We have all these diseases that have been wiped out: tuberculosis, scarlet fever, smallpox, all this other stuff. Now, in 1915, was his daughter's death due to his mental state? Because during the season over there, his nerves got the best of him, and I even think, he had to leave the Braves for a little bit. What was going on here?
I think he was just wound so tight, and baseball was everything, that that these other things just, like I said, he had a lot of things happen to him. You have tremendous success on the field and just tragedy off of it. And I think it was just too much for him. It's part of what made him a great competitor, also kind of destroyed him emotionally.
And now pretty much 1914 was his last great season. And, he starts to slide, and then the Braves put him on waivers at midseason. I think in 1917 he was claimed by the Phillies. He rejected an offer to go down to the international leagues, I think to become manager of the Jersey City Skeeters. And then he signed with the Boston Red Sox as a player coach for the 1918 season, but was released without playing a game for them. What was going on there?
Well, he got into a fight with the manager, and that probably did it. He was actually roomed with Babe Ruth. I think the Reds, during spring training, I think the Red Sox thought of him as a coach, and he thought himself more as a player, and that was part of it. And then there was some disagreement over what the Ed Barrow, who was the manager, had made a call in a game of spring training, and Evers basically was blaming Barrow for a mistake, and I think he was battling his teammates. The Red Sox had won the World Series in 1915 and 16, so they were an accomplished team, and here was Evers trying to prod them on to success, and they're saying, well, we're already successful. That we don't need that, and I think those conflicts ended up with him being released on opening day, even though he had actually been, there was a picture of the starting lineup of the infield of the Boston Red Sox that was in the Boston Globe, and he was going to be the starting second baseman. But when the season opened, he was sitting in the stands, released, and Charlie Wagner was in his place as coach. So he kind of talked himself out of a spot with the Red Sox.
He also talked himself out of the Major League in the United States. How the heck did he get to France?
Well, that was with the Knights of Columbus. They were sponsoring some goodwill baseball instruction over to soldiers in France, both American and French, and he jumped at the chance to be involved in that. So he called that one of the proudest chapters of his life, and he would go over to England to Europe a couple more times, especially when he was managing the White Sox in the 20s, and took a team over there to play some exhibition games. So he was very interested in spreading the sport and teaching the sport to others.
And, in 1920, he comes back. How did him and McGraw get along? But he was a coach, with the 1920 New York Giants.
Well, they got along pretty well. He kind of tried to mind his P's and Q's a little more. McGraw got into some legal issues that year and was away from the team quite a bit, and Evers ran it and did a really good job when he got there. The Giants were in 7th place. I think they ended up in 2nd, which kind of, again, fit his persona. He had gotten that job coming off of helping scout for the Cincinnati Reds against the White Sox in 1919. And his good work with the Giants ended up getting him a job managing the Cubs for a second time, William Wrigley, in 1921, although that stint didn't end up being quite as successful.
And he had a few other stints, I think Hank Gowdy played him in one game in 1929, making Evers the oldest player in the league for that year. He also coached the Braves under Bill McKechnie in 1930, and then he became a general manager of the Albany Senators there's the New York Penn League in 1935. But what a lot of people didn't know is he bought Albany Senators stock and gave it to his 11-year-old son over there.
Yeah, he was a booster of the Albany team, the local team. That was kind of his area. He and his wife had separated. I don't think their relationship was ever the same after their daughter died. But he tried to stay in contact with his son, their only living child. And yeah, that was one of the things that he did to kind of keep him involved in wanting to. It was kind of his way of staying connected, I think, to his son.
His son.
One of those tragedies of his life, yeah.
Well, his son, John Evans Jr., he served as a lieutenant in World War II, and he was in the Pacific. Very interesting. Now, here's the continuing stuff on as we're ending, Evers' last years. He went back to Albany, operated a sporting goods store, and then he filed for bankruptcy in 1936. Unbelievable.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's just again, his life away from the game was tough on him. The Depression came along, and a lot of businesses had that problem, and he certainly suffered from that.
And we know that he was the superintendent of Bleecker Stadium in Albany. He taught baseball, especially to a lot of Sandlot players. And if it couldn't get any worse for Evers, in 1942, he endured a stroke which paralyzed the right side of his body. And for 5 years he lingered. Now, let me ask you this question, because it's very interesting and it's befitting that such a bittersweet occurrence happens here, and then, of course, Evers dies, but he's nominated into the Hall of Fame, I think, in 1946, and then a year later he passes on. Why did the Hall of Fame wait so long to put him in there?
Well, some of it was the rules, the number of people that you had to vote for. There wasn't anybody getting into the Hall of Fame, and there was a lot of frustration with that. So they formed the Veterans Committee and went back and tried to right some wrongs. Evers finished second in the voting a couple of years, but there was no one getting the 75% anymore. I think Rogers Hornsby had gotten in, and it had been like 2 or 3 years, and nobody was getting voted in. Some of it was because of the number of players that had to be on the ballot that you had to vote for, and no one was getting enough of a vote. So the Veterans Committee ended up voting him in. He was still alive when that happened, but he died before the induction ceremony in 1947.
Now, let me ask you something. Did I leave any stones unturned in my inquisition over here, my cross-examination of you for Johnny Evers?
No, I think the thing that was interesting about him is he was really a singular. He was a person all about baseball all the time. He would talk about it all the time. And he stayed current in the game. I tell a story about, in the 40s after he's paralyzed, he's still watching the game close enough that he's talking about Carl Hubbell's losing his stuff. And people are kind of looking at him, what do you mean? Carl Hubbell was just finishing up his 5th straight 20-win season and led the league in strikeouts the year that Evers was talking about. But he noticed something, and after that season, Hubbell never won more than 11 games. He was a keen student of the game. Again, he just loved talking the game. He loved sports. He loved promoting it. Was a real, like Lefty, an ambassador of the game, and a really fascinating character. Who fought for anything. Alabama Pitts, the prisoner, who baseball wasn't going to let play. He went and fought for him. He fought for what he thought was right. He may not have been right all the time, but if nothing else, he was certainly a fighter, and has been forgotten about how great an athlete he was and how great a player he was and how much he contributed to winning on the teams that he was involved in.
I know we could get this book on the internet. We get it at McFarland. I know you have a website. Where else can we get this?
I think those are probably the best places. There is a Facebook page for the book as well. So, any of those places will lead you to being able to purchase the book.
Well, I hope you had a good time today, Dennis. I love talking to you because all your books are about obscure things, and that's what enlightens all of us. Pretty much in mainstream, what you get off of ESPN, and this is why I get shows like this, and this is why I'm honored to have you folks on my show, because I know my listeners are going to learn a heck of a lot about Johnny Evers, just like they did about Lefty O'Doul. Want to have you back. I love having you on the show, and every time I talk to you, I'm learning something new about whatever subject we're talking about, whether it's Lefty or Johnny. So we'll do that. Hang on a second. Let me end the show. I'll talk to you after I end the show. Folks, I had a great time with Dennis. I had a great time with Johnny Evers. Go out. The holiday seasons are coming out. This book has been praised. I've read it cover to cover. Excellent stuff. A couple of my questions to Dennis, and let him talk about it rather than me, because who the hell wants to hear me, I'm just a little guy. Well, the big guys live in California. So go out, get the book. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I'm Ian Kahanowitz, in for the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. And in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.